Welcome to the UPSC News Analysis for 14th June 2025. Every concept in the text explained. This episode breaks down key current affairs, explains basic concepts, and highlights main relevant issues, all tailored for UPSC aspirants. Today we're taking a deep dive into a stack of sources that, well, they really paint a picture of India's current landscape. We're looking at everything from a national tragedy in the aviation sector to the ripple effects of distant geopolitics, shifts in how our cities function, and even the evolving dynamics within families.
Right.
We'll pull out the crucial insights and connect them back to what matters for understanding these complex issues, especially, for your exam preparation.
It's really about seeing how interconnected everything is, isn't it? A seemingly isolated event can expose these deep-seated systemic issues, or like you said, a global crisis can hit you directly in the pocket. Our goal is to help you see those threads.
Absolutely. So let's start with something incredibly somber, actually, the recent Air India flight AI-171 crash. The sources really highlight this as a stark example of the concerns around aviation safety in India right now.
It really was a truly tragic incident. That was June 12, 2025. An Air India Boeing 787-8 Dreamliner crashed just minutes after taking off from Ahmedabad. Tragically, only one person survived.
The detail that really jumps out from the sources is just how low the aircraft was. It reportedly only reached, 625 feet before hitting a 70-foot building directly in the takeoff path.
Exactly.
That immediately flags some serious red warning signs, doesn't it, about potential factors beyond just the aircraft itself.
Precisely. And the sources point out something pretty unprecedented. This was reportedly the first ever hull loss globally for a Boeing 787 Dreamliner.
Wow.
That fact alone makes this crash stand out and, frankly, demands a really thorough investigation.
Okay. Before we dig into the potential causes and, maybe more importantly, the systemic issues the sources are highlighting, let's quickly define some key terms they use. Hull loss. That just means the aircraft is essentially destroyed, right? Can't get on repair.
Correct. Then you have DGCA, that's India's aviation regulator, the Directorate General of Civil Aviation.
Okay.
ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, sets the global safety standards that countries are expected to follow.
Right, the international body.
Then SMS, Safety Management System. It's a way for airlines and airports to proactively manage safety risks.
Proactive, okay.
FOD stands for Foreign Object Damage, basically. Stuff left on runways that can cause damage. Think debris.
Like in that Concorde crash.
Yeah, exactly, that kind of scenario.
Yeah.
And bird strike is pretty self-explanatory, but a very real hazard, especially for engines during takeoff or landing. And finally, Vihan.ai, that's Air India's big transformation plan under the Tata Group.
Got it. Understanding those terms definitely helps frame the problems and potential solutions.
Right.
So let's talk causes. The sources discuss possible immediate factors for the crash.
Yeah, they float a few technical possibilities. Bird ingestion, for instance, which could lead to a compressor stall and a loss of thrust.
Right.
Or perhaps FOD on the runway causing engine or structural damage.
They also mentioned the possibility, didn't they, that the landing gear might have stayed extended, creating significant drag.
Yes, that's another potential factor. It would make it very difficult for the aircraft to climb effectively. One source even speculated about whether it might have been a training flight, maybe issues with control transfer.
Okay.
But, and this is crucial, the sources really emphasize that while the immediate cause needs investigation, the systemic failures that might have enabled such an event, those are just as critical, if not more so.
And this is where it gets really interesting and, frankly, quite troubling, based on the critique in the sources. They link the incident directly to potential systemic flaws. Like, if a bird strike was involved, why were there birds? The source points to overgrown grass near the runway. That suggests maybe monsoon preparation protocols weren't followed.
That's the implication. And hitting a building in the takeoff path, that absolutely screams regulatory failure regarding construction clearances near airports. It shouldn't be there.
Right. And what's fascinating, or maybe disturbing, is the sharp critique about regulatory accountability. The sources note the DGCA apparently named the pilots very quickly after the crash.
Yes, which, according to the sources, actually violates ICAO norms about independent investigation processes. You're supposed to investigate first, not point fingers immediately.
I saw that. And one source makes a very strong statement saying safety accountability in India's aviation sector is deeply flawed, and I think the quote was, "Rot starts at the top." That's a powerful accusation.
It is, and the source bases this on what they see as a historical pattern. After major crashes in India, they argue the focus often shifts very quickly to pilot error.
Diverting attention.
Potentially diverting attention from deeper systemic issues. Things like, lapses in regulatory oversight, poor infrastructure maintenance, or even weaknesses in governance structure.
So this isn't being presented as just an isolated incident, but possibly part of a recurring pattern they see.
Exactly. The sources actually reference previous crashes like IC-605 back in 1990 or IX-812, the Mangaluru crash in 2010, where despite investigations highlighting systemic problems, the follow-through on crucial reforms was apparently neglected or insufficient.
They also brought in the judicial angle, didn't they? Pointing out that after the Mangaluru crash, the Supreme Court dismissed a PIL seeking reforms.
That's right.
Effectively sending it back to the Ministry of Civil Aviation, which, well, some might interpret that as the judiciary stepping back from enforcing accountability in this area.
And then there's the concern about political interference. The sources mention leadership roles at DGCA and AAI often going to bureaucrats, generalists, rather than seasoned aviation professionals. This could potentially influence accident investigations and day-to-day regulatory decisions.
So the picture being painted is that India's rapid growth in aviation, it hasn't really been matched by a maturing safety culture or, robust independent regulatory mechanisms.
That's the core argument you find in these sources, yes.
Right.
Speed of expansion seems to have outpaced the development of the safety infrastructure, the regulatory capacity, and crucially, the kind of accountability framework required by international standards like ICAOs. There's a perceived deficit in independent, specialized expertise at key levels.
Okay. But the sources do acknowledge some positive steps, right? I mean, DGCA has mandated things like flight data monitoring, FDM, and these safety management systems, SMS.
Yes, those mandates exist. Most of policies also talk about safety, though the sources question the effectiveness of the implementation.
Right.
And Air India, now under Tata, is implementing Vihan.ai, which specifically includes creating a dedicated group head of safety role. That's a positive structural move. And the involvement of international investigators from the US NTSB and the UK's AAIB in this specific AI-171 probe that's seen as a potential factor that could bring greater transparency, something the sources imply has been lacking historically.
Right. More eyes on the process.
Yeah.
Okay, let's think about this through the lens of preparing for the UPSC exams. For a mains answer analyzing issues in the aviation sector, what are the big takeaways or challenges from this source material we should focus on?
Well, you definitely want to analyze points like regulatory capture. That's the idea that the regulator becomes too close to the industry it's supposed to regulate, maybe due to bureaucratic or political appointments weakening oversight.
Okay.
Training deficiencies, potential gaps in simulator training, CRM or crew resource management issues, infrastructure risks like these building violations near airports, or poor runway maintenance, FOD issues, judicial weakness, perhaps the apparent hesitancy of courts to maybe push harder on accountability through PILs in some cases, and certainly the transparency deficit, premature blame on pilots, delays in publishing final reports, which can undermine public trust.
And the impacts of all these issues, what are the consequences?
Well, obviously, declining public confidence in air travel safety, a potential hit to India's reputation globally in the aviation sector. It points to failures in institutional governance. There are environmental consequences of crashes, too. And it raises questions about India's actual compliance with international safety standards versus just, ticking boxes.
From a governance and ethics perspective.
It centers on that misplaced focus blaming pilots instead of systems, the lack of professional, specialized leadership in key regulatory bodies, and as we mentioned, the judiciary's role, or perhaps lack of a strong role, in ensuring accountability.
Got it. That's quite a lot for mains. And for prelims, what specific facts or terms should aspirants highlight from this?
Definitely remember the AI-171 crash specifics. The fact it was a Boeing 787's first hull loss globally is significant. The date, June 12, 2025. The low altitude reached, key bodies, DGCA, ICAO, Air India's transformation plan, Vihan.ai.
Okay.
Potential immediate causes discussed, bird strikes, FOD, and the international investigators involved, NTSB from the US, AAID from the UK.
Right. So looking ahead, what did the sources suggest as a way forward? How do we fix these apparently deep-seated problems.
They strongly recommend appointing actual aviation professionals, people with deep domain expertise, to lead DGCA and AAI, not just generalist bureaucrats.
Makes sense?
Strict enforcement of ICO norms, not just having them on paper. They call for truly independent accident investigations, ideally with international oversight to ensure credibility. Judicial reforms are mentioned, perhaps a specialized bench or process for aviation safety cases. Mandatory standardized training across the board. Transparent audits. Crucially, enforcing height restrictions and zoning laws around airports.
Stop buildings getting too close.
Exactly. And fundamentally, shifting from just reactive compliance to building a proactive safety culture. And importantly, enacting pilot protection laws to prevent that cycle of premature blame before investigations are complete.
This whole situation really underscores that rapid infrastructure growth, well, it means very little without robust, independent safety governance and accountability, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
It's such a critical sector, and its health impacts travelers, trade, India's global standing. It really makes you think, how does a nation balance that relentless push for growth with the absolute necessity of safety and strong institutions? It's a core governance challenge right there.
A very real-world example of governance in action, or perhaps inaction, as some of these sources suggest. Now, shall we pivot to a different kind of challenge? One playing out on the global stage, but with very direct economic impacts on India.
Right, let's talk about the escalating tensions in West Asia, specifically between Israel and Iran.
The news the sources cover highlights recent Israeli strikes, targeting places like Iran's Natanz nuclear facility, missile production sites, apparently even homes of scientists.
And what's particularly notable, according to the sources, is the timing these strikes were reportedly happening while U.S. and Iranian officials were supposedly engaged in nuclear talks elsewhere.
Yes, that timing definitely adds another layer of complexity to the whole situation. Iran, in turn, has retaliated with drone attacks, and there was anticipation of potential ballistic missile responses as well.
And the U.S. seemed unable to restrain Israel here.
That's what the sources suggest, that despite the ongoing talks with Iran, the U.S. couldn't prevent Israel from carrying out these actions.
Okay, let's quickly run through some key terms for this topic. JCPOA.
That's the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, which the U.S. pulled out of later.
Right, IAEA.
International Atomic Energy Agency. They're the UN's nuclear watchdog, responsible for monitoring nuclear activities globally.
Got it. Ballistic missiles, long-range guided missiles.
Yeah.
And geographically, 2 points are absolutely vital for India. The Strait of Hormuz.
A critical choke point. About 20% of the world's total oil supply passes through that narrow strait.
20%. And the Suez Canal Red Sea route.
Another vital shipping lane, especially for trade between Asia and Europe.
Okay. And for India, the context is oil dependency. We import something like 80% of our crude oil needs, right?
Around that figure, yes. Which makes those geographical points and regional stability incredibly important for us.
And it makes it clear why tensions in West Asia aren't just distant news. The sources detail significant economic risks for India, don't they?
They certainly do. For instance, oil prices reportedly spiked 8% almost immediately after that Israeli attack was reported.
An 8% jump in oil prices.
Mm.
That translates pretty quickly into inflation risks back home in India, doesn't it? For fuel, for transport, for everything.
Absolutely. And the Strait of Hormuz. That's a massive vulnerability for India. Our major oil suppliers, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, UAE, they all rely heavily on passage through that strait.
So any significant disruption there.
Could cause a severe supply shock to India. Major problems for our energy security.
And it's not just oil, is it? The Suez Canal and Red Sea route. If that becomes too dangerous or gets shut down due to conflict.
Ships have to reroute all the way around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa.
Which adds huge time and cost.
Exactly. The sources estimate it adds about 15-20 extra days to the journey. And the cost. Maybe $500 to $1,000 per container. That could increase overall shipping costs by something like 40–50%.
Wow. Imagine the impact on Indian exports. Engineering goods, pharmaceuticals, textiles makes them much less competitive.
Precisely. And we also saw gold prices jump, which is a classic safe haven move. When global uncertainty flares up like this, investors get nervous.
So these geopolitical events have very tangible, direct impacts back home, which is also why India's diplomatic moves, like its recent UN vote, are so closely watched.
That's right. The sources noted that on June 13, 2025, there was an emergency session of the UN General Assembly about this escalation. A resolution condemning the actions was put forward.
And India chose to abstain on that vote.
Correct. India abstained.
And the sources explain India's reasoning.
Yes, the stated reasons were urging de-escalation and diplomacy from all sides, suggesting the resolution didn't fully capture the complexity of the situation, reaffirming commitment to sovereignty and international law, and basically calling for restraint.
It sounds like India's classic strategic balancing act.
It really reflects that tightrope walk India constantly performs in the region. We need the oil imports from West Asia. We have increasingly strong strategic ties with Israel, especially in defense and technology.
Right.
But we also have deep historical and economic ties with Iran. Chabahar port, for instance, is seen as vital for our connectivity ambitions towards Central Asia. So alienating any one major player is very difficult and potentially counterproductive.
So what are the government's interventions mentioned in the sources beyond the UN vote?
Well, there's that consistent diplomatic push for de-escalation, talking to all sides, maintaining our strategic petroleum reserves to cushion against supply shocks, efforts towards diversifying energy sources, though that's a long-term game, and advising Indian shipping companies on risk assessment and potentially alternative routes or insurance.
And this fits into India's broader historical approach.
Yes, the sources emphasize India's long-standing policy of strategic autonomy, basically, avoiding taking sides in regional conflicts, whether it's Israel-Palestine or Saudi-Iran rivalries. India has consistently supported a two-state solution for Israel-Palestine and favored reviving the JCPOA nuclear deal with Iran.
And engaging through various platforms.
Exactly. India engages with all relevant parties through forums like I2U2, which interestingly includes India, Israel, the UAE, and the U.S.
Right.
Also through BRICS, which now includes Iran, and through G20, and of course bilateral channels. It's about keeping lines of communication open with everyone.
Okay, let's break this down for UPSC again. For mains, what are the core challenges and issues this West Asia situation highlights for India?
Primarily, it's our energy security vulnerability, that heavy reliance on oil imports from a notoriously volatile region. Second, the challenge of maintaining geopolitical balance, managing complex relationships with regional powers like Israel and Iran, who are often at odds. Third, the clear economic risks inflation from oil price shocks, the impact on trade costs from shipping disruptions.
Okay.
And finally, the ongoing challenge of exercising strategic autonomy, how India maintains its independent foreign policy and protects its national interests in a very messy, multipolar world.
And the impacts are felt across diplomacy, economy, strategy.
Absolutely. Diplomatic impacts in how India positions itself, economic impacts as we discuss oil, inflation, trade, even remittances from the large Indian diaspora in the Gulf, strategic implications for India's broader engagement in West Asia, and there are governance and ethical dimensions too, balancing realpolitik calculations with stated principles, defining national interest versus global responsibility, and the consequences of unchecked militarism in the region.
Got it. And for prelims, key facts to flag.
Remember the specific events. Israel attacked Natanz, Iran retaliated with drones. Know the JCPOA acronym, India's oil import dependency figure, roughly 80%, the Strait of Hormuz significance, about 20% of global oil transit, the impact of Suez-Red Sea closure on shipping time and cost,
Okay.
the fact that gold prices surged, India's UNGA vote the date, June 13th, 2025, and the fact that India abstained. And be aware of key groupings like I2U2 and the strategic importance of Chabahar port for India.
Right. And the way forward suggested by the sources.
Generally, it focuses on promoting dialogue through international platforms like the UN, BRICS, etc., pushing for the revival of the JCPOA, strengthening India's own energy security, larger strategic reserves, faster push on renewables, more energy source diversification, exploring alternative shipping insurance mechanisms, bolstering export credit guarantees for affected businesses, enhancing maritime security cooperation, positioning India potentially as a mediator where possible. But above all, maintaining that strategic autonomy, deepening partnerships like Chabahar, and prioritizing the safety of the Indian diaspora and our core economic interests.
It's incredibly clear how events seemingly far away can directly affect your wallet through fuel prices, the cost of imported goods. This whole situation forces us and policymakers to really grapple with what strategic autonomy actually means in practice when you have critical relationships on all sides of a very volatile conflict. It's a constant and complex balancing act.
Definitely. A real tightrope. Now let's bring it closer to home again. Let's look at some domestic, urban policy and social dynamics. First up, this row over bike taxi policy.
Yeah, this development comes from Karnataka. The news is that on June 14th, 2025, the state government told the High Court it had made a policy decision not to frame rules that would allow bike taxis to operate via aggregators. Essentially, they're saying no, citing Section 93 of the Motor Vehicles Act.
Right. And this decision came after a High Court judgment back in April, which had actually banned bike taxi operations until the government notified specific guidelines. The court had set a deadline of June 15th.
So the deadline was looming.
Exactly. The aggregators had appealed that ruling, tried to get interim relief to keep operating, but that failed. So this government decision basically seals it for now in Karnataka.
So this decision lands right in the middle of a conflict between different groups, doesn't it? On one side, you have the industry aggregators, supported by bodies like NASCOM. They're obviously pushing back, calling for consultation, warning about the livelihoods of maybe 25,000 to 30,000 gig workers who depend on this. And they point to other states like Delhi and Telangana where bike taxis are allowed to operate.
That's the industry perspective. On the other hand, you have the traditional transport unions, auto rickshaw unions, for example. They've strongly opposed bike taxis from the start.
Why? What are their main arguments?
They cite concerns about unfair competition, passenger safety issues, especially regarding helmets and insurance coverage. They claim in allegations that aggregators are sort of evading existing regulations.
So the core problem here seems to be a gap in the law and policy.
Pretty much. The main central law, the Motor Vehicles Act of 1988, it doesn't explicitly clarify the rules for using private two-wheelers commercially to ferry passengers. And Karnataka's own state-level rules from 2016, the On-Demand Transportation Technology Aggregators rules, were apparently silent specifically on bike taxis.
This legal gray area has led to inconsistency across different states then.
Exactly. You mentioned Delhi and Telangana allow them. Maharashtra is reportedly drafting rules. Tamil Nadu seems opposed. And now Karnataka has made its decision. No rules means no operations via aggregators for now. It highlights that lack of national uniformity.
Okay, let's look at this for mains prep. This bike taxi issue touches on several key themes, right?
Absolutely. First, there's the theme of legal ambiguity, and then for maybe national policy uniformity versus state-level decisions. Second, genuine safety concerns, helmets, insurance standards, vehicle fitness, rider vetting. Third, that fundamental debate about fair competition. How do you balance new tech-driven services with the interests of existing traditional transport providers? Fourth, the crucial issue of gig economy worker rights. These aren't traditional employees, so how do you ensure livelihood protection and fair conditions?
Right, the Social Security aspect.
Then there's urban mobility. Can bike taxis genuinely help with last-mile connectivity, or do they just add to congestion and safety risks? And finally, environmental concerns, although that's maybe less of an issue if the push is towards electric bike taxis.
And the impacts.
Well, uncertainty for startups investing in this sector. Potential disruption for workers who relied on it, but maybe relief for traditional unions. It shows inconsistency in policy across the federal structure, and it raises questions about the state's capacity to regulate these rapidly evolving mobility services effectively.
What about ethics and governance?
Key issues there are transparency in the policymaking process. Was there enough consultation? How do you balance encouraging innovation with ensuring public safety and fair competition? And the social justice dimension for these gig workers, are their interests being adequately considered?
Got it. Quick facts for prelims here.
Remember the Karnataka government's decision date, June 14th, 2025. The relevant section of the central law I mentioned, Section 93 of the Motor Vehicles Act, 1988. NASCOM as an industry body involved. Maybe the Karnataka On-Demand Rules 2016 as context for state rules. And possibly DCRE, Directorate of Civil Rights Enforcement, might come up in discussions about enforcement, though maybe less central.
Okay. And the way forward suggested in the sources, how could this be resolved better?
Well, the sources suggest several things. A clear national policy framework under the MVA could provide much-needed uniformity and clarity.
A national standard.
Potentially. A proper consultative process involving all stakeholders, aggregators, workers, traditional unions, passenger groups, city planners is seen as crucial before making final decisions. Define clear licensing norms covering safety standards, helmets, insurance, vehicle fitness, driver verification, maybe even fare structures. Some suggest pilot projects, maybe focusing on electric bike taxis in designated areas or as part of a regulatory sandbox, harmonizing state-level policies to avoid this fragmented landscape, and, critically, ensuring welfare measures and social security nets for the gig workers involved, plus ongoing monitoring of the actual impact on traffic, pollution, safety, and livelihoods.
This feels like such a classic modern governance challenge, doesn't it? Technology disrupts an established sector, and the government have to figure out how to regulate it, balancing innovation, safety, livelihoods, competition.
Exactly. It's a push and pull we're seeing in many sectors, and this Karnataka bike taxi case is a really clear current example of that struggle. How cities manage mobility is constantly evolving.
It really is. And speaking of evolving social structures and policy challenges, let's turn to another critical domestic issue that affects almost everyone: the state of elder care and intergenerational relationships in India. There's a recent report out on this.
Yes, this comes from Helpage India, a well-known NGO working on issues concerning the elderly. The report, released around June 14th, 2025, delves into intergenerational dynamics and the kind of care older adults are receiving or perhaps not receiving.
And the findings sound quite concerning based on the source material.
They are quite striking. The report found that a really significant number of elderly people feel their children don't spend adequate time with them. 59% of respondents felt this way, according to the source.
Wow, that's more than half. That's sobering.
It is. And it gets starker. 35%, over a third, reported experiencing neglect in some form. There's also a clear trend of more elderly people living alone, and this trend is apparently sharper in urban areas.
Financial dependency is also highlighted as a major issue.
Yes, the report states about 42% are financially dependent on their families. It also flagged rising instances of emotional abuse, which is often harder to detect, and widespread issues of loneliness and associated mental health problems among the aged population. These aren't just numbers. They point to significant shifts and strains in family support systems.
And this is happening against the backdrop of India's demographic shift. We're aging quite rapidly as a country, aren't we?
Exactly. That's the crucial context. The sources point out that India already has around 140 million people aged 60 and above, and that number is projected to double by 2050.
Double.
Yes, it's a massive demographic shift. And the concern is that existing family structures and social support systems are struggling to adapt to this change. Policy development also seems to be lagging behind the curve.
The report mentions something about compression of morbidity.
Right. That concept suggests that while people are living longer, they might be spending more years dealing with chronic health issues. And India, demographically, is aging faster than many Western countries did, giving us less time to adapt our systems.
Now, there are some existing government frameworks in place to support the elderly, aren't there?
Yes, the sources do mention several key ones. There's the Maintenance and Welfare of Parents and Senior Citizens Act of 2007 that provides a legal framework for children to provide maintenance to their parents.
Okay.
There are schemes like Rashtriya Vayosha Yojana, which provides assistive living devices like wheelchairs, hearing aids to eligible seniors. There's a broader National Action Plan for Senior Citizens, NAPSRC. The SAGE portal that's relatively newer, aimed at promoting private sector involvement, supporting startups in the elder care space. There are senior citizens welfare funds and various state-level pension schemes, too.
So, frameworks exist on paper, but the Helpage Report's findings suggest there are significant gaps between the policy intent and the reality on the ground for many elderly people. For Maines, what are the key challenges this report points to?
Well, the breakdown of traditional joint family structures is a big one, driven partly by urbanization and migration.
Right, people moving for jobs.
Exactly, which often leaves elderly parents alone, especially in rural areas or smaller towns. There are significant gaps in accessible and affordable healthcare, particularly specialized geriatric care doctors and facilities trained to handle the specific needs of older adults. Financial insecurity is huge, especially for elderly women who may not have worked formally or those from the informal sector with no pensions or savings. Digital illiteracy and exclusion are growing problems as more services move online.
That's a big one.
Yes. And the significant issue of underreporting of elder abuse, physical, emotional, financial. Plus, a general policy gap specifically around addressing mental health needs, loneliness, depression, dementia support for the elderly.
What are the broader impacts of these challenges beyond the individuals affected?
On society, you could argue it leads to a loss of social capital, maybe a weakening of intergenerational bonds, and the potential loss of traditional knowledge held by elders. Economically, it highlights the growing need for a formal elder care economy services, products, skilled workforce, which is currently underdeveloped.
A whole new sector needed.
Potentially, yes. Governance-ally, it puts increasing pressure on public healthcare systems, social welfare programs, and pension schemes. Ethically, it forces us to think about moving from a charity-based view of elder care towards a rights-based approach, ensuring dignity, autonomy, and participation for older adults.
Okay. For prelims, what are the quick facts or terms to keep in mind from this?
Definitely know the organization. Helpage India, the key legislation. Maintenance and Welfare of Parents and Senior Citizens Act, 2007. Schemes like Rashtriya Vayashri Yojana and the SAGE portal. The approximate current size of India's elderly population around 140 million. And that term, compression of morbidity.
Right. And the path forward. What do the sources suggest needs to be done?
They generally call for updating the national policy on senior citizens to make it more dynamic, more responsive to current realities. Strengthening Social Security is key, working towards more universal pension coverage, finding ways to include the informal sector better, promoting community-based care models involving local bodies, NGOs, maybe even resident welfare associations, actively fostering intergenerational bonding, perhaps through school programs, community events, encouraging corporate social responsibility initiatives in this area.
Bridging the gap.
Exactly. Expanding accessible and affordable geriatric healthcare, including mental health services, increasing public awareness campaigns about elder abuse and how to report it safely, encouraging elder-friendly urban planning, thinking about transport, housing, public spaces, and using digital platforms not to exclude, but to include the elderly, focusing on digital literacy programs and accessible interfaces.
This report really does hold a mirror up to society, doesn't it? It asks fundamental questions about family responsibility, community support, and how we, as a rapidly modernizing nation, care for the generation that built the India we live in today.
It does.
It's a significant policy challenge, clearly, but it also feels like a call to action for individuals and communities, too. How does India balance this relentless push for modernization and urbanization with preserving its social fabric and ensuring dignity for its growing elderly population? A huge question.
A vital question for our collective future, indeed. Okay, finally, let's shift gears one last time. Let's look at a sector that's often seen as a symbol of that very modernization and economic growth, the Indian startup ecosystem.
Right, and the latest news on this front comes from the Global Startup Ecosystem Report, or GSER, for 2025. This one's by an organization called Startup Genome, and the big headline seems to be Bengaluru's performance again.
Yes. Bengaluru was ranked 14th globally in this latest report. It maintained its position as the clear #1 in India. And notably, it also secured the top spot, #1, in all of Asia, specifically for affordable talent.
Affordable talent, okay?
Yeah.
That's a key factor for startups.
Absolutely crucial. Delhi also saw an improvement in its ranking, which is good news. The report mentioned the top 3 global ecosystems remain, perhaps unsurprisingly, Silicon Valley, New York City, and London.
And the report specifically highlighted Bengaluru's strengths. What makes it stand out?
Yes, it pointed to several things. That strong, deep pool of tech talent, obviously. A leading position in emerging high-tech areas like artificial intelligence and deep tech, robust venture capital investment activity continuing, that relatively affordable cost structure, especially compared to top global hubs, and its strong global connectedness links with major ecosystems like Silicon Valley, Israel, the UK, Singapore, for talent, capital, and markets.
Government initiatives have definitely played a role in fostering this ecosystem over the years, haven't they?
Oh, absolutely. The National Startup India initiative, launched back in 2016, was pivotal. It provided various incentives focused on easing regulations, creating incubation centers.
Right.
And Karnataka, as a state, was also an early mover. They had their own state-level policies, set up an innovation authority, ran programs like Elevate 100 to specifically fund and mentor local startups.
And Bengaluru's concentration of talent, fueled by premier institutions like IITB, IISc, IMTB, that's a massive advantage. Hosting, about 40% of India's tech startups?
Roughly that percentage, yes. It creates a powerful network effect. And we shouldn't forget the role of India's digital public infrastructure, things like UPI for payments, ONDC for e-commerce. These are unique platforms that are enabling startups to build scalable businesses and reach vast markets much faster than before.
Yeah.
Global collaborations also play a part.
Okay, so strong performance, especially from Bengaluru. But looking at this remains, what are the big challenges or areas for improvement that still exist, despite the positive rankings?
Well, the sources often point to the uneven distribution of this success. How do we scale this startup growth beyond just Bengaluru and Delhi NCR? How do we build vibrant, sustainable startup hubs in Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities across India?
Spreading the benefits.
Exactly. Regulatory hurdles and compliance burdens, while eased somewhat, are still cited as challenges, especially for early-stage companies. Access to later-stage funding, the larger growth capital needed to scale globally, that remains a challenge for many Indian startups compared to, say, U.S. or Chinese counterparts. There's the perennial issue of brain drain, retaining top tech and entrepreneurial talent within India versus losing them to opportunities abroad. And addressing the inclusion gap, ensuring that the startup ecosystem is accessible and beneficial for entrepreneurs from smaller cities, from diverse backgrounds, including increasing participation from women founders and investors.
Right. What about the overall impacts of the startup ecosystem's growth? Where is it making a difference?
Significant impacts on the economy, certainly. Sources suggest it contributes around 5% to GDP now, creates substantial employment, drives innovation, and enhances India's global competitiveness. On society, it's fostering an innovation culture, creating new types of jobs, demanding new skill sets. On polity, it creates demand for more progressive policy frameworks, pushes government towards digital governance solutions.
And ethically,
Yes.
governance-wise.
Key issues there include ensuring inclusive innovation, making sure the benefits reach broadly and don't worsen the digital divide, and promoting responsible innovation, encouraging sustainability, ethical practices, rather than just chasing valuations at any environmental or social cost.
Okay. For prelims, key facts to lock in.
Remember the report, GSCR by Startup Genome, Startup India Initiative launch year, 2016, Bengaluru's ranks, 14th global, #OneIndia, and crucially, #OneInAsia for affordable talent. The rough percentage of India's tech startups hosted in Bengaluru, around 40%, and maybe the top 3 global ecosystems for context: Silicon Valley, New York, London.
Got it. And the suggested way forward to build on this success and address the challenges.
The sources generally recommend actively building and promoting startup hubs in Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities, providing infrastructure and mentorship there, promoting innovation not just in software, but in critical areas like deep tech, green tech, health tech, strengthening ties between industry and academia further for research translation and talent development, benchmarking India's ecosystem competitiveness against global best practices continuously, simplifying intellectual property rights protection and further reducing compliance burdens, actively promoting participation from women and underrepresented groups in the startup space, and really encouraging that ethos of responsible innovation. So yeah, India's startup scene is clearly booming, a major driver of economic change and innovation, gaining global recognition. But as you pointed out, what does this boom truly mean for the broader economy and society? How do we ensure this wave of innovation isn't just confined to a few prosperous open pockets, but actually lifts the whole country? And how do we ensure it benefits everyone and tackles some of India's pressing societal challenges, not just generates the next billion-dollar valuation? Important questions.
Absolutely. All great points to ponder.
Yeah.
Okay, let's try and maybe tie some of these threads together for a final provocative thought for our listeners. We've covered quite a bit today. We looked at a tragic plane crash, potentially stemming from deep systemic governance failures in a critical sector. We looked at a distant geopolitical conflict in West Asia, directly impacting India's economy through oil prices and trade routes. We saw a policy struggle over urban transport bike taxis, highlighting the challenges of regulating new technology and the gig economy. And we discussed a report revealing strain on traditional family structures and the growing challenges of elder care in a rapidly changing India.
And what really stands out when you put them all together, I think, is that all these diverse topics, from global conflicts to local policy rows and fundamental social shifts, they ultimately connect back to the complexities of managing incredibly rapid change in a vast, diverse developing nation like India. They highlight this constant tension, this balancing act between pushing hard for economic growth, for technological advancement, for modernization, while simultaneously needing to ensure fundamental safety, social well-being, and crucially, having effective, adaptable institutions and governance structures that can actually keep pace with that change.
Exactly. It really makes you think, doesn't it? As India navigates these external geopolitical storms and charges ahead on technological frontiers like startups and AI, Can its fundamental institutional capacity, its regulatory bodies, its judicial processes, and its core social foundations, like family support systems, actually keep pace?
That's the core question.
How does the country ensure that in this relentless pursuit of progress, it doesn't inadvertently sacrifice safety, or leave vulnerable populations behind, or undermine the very social values and institutional strengths that are also part of its identity? How do you protect citizens and values while modernizing?
A profound challenge and something definitely worth reflecting on long after this deep dive ends.
Indeed. Subscribe for daily updates and drop a comment to share your thoughts. Please join the Telegram channel link given in the description to read this news and solve a quiz based on this.